So, we've all heard stories about the Bush family business legacy, right? I mean, that George W. Bush had kind of a string of business failures, yet was always being kind of promoted to the top eventually to the presidency of the United States. And then the same thing true with George Herbert Walker Bush. I mean, he was involved with a lot of companies, but, none of them were ever going to be Fortune 500 companies, yet he always seemed to come out just fine out of the deal. So how did that work? Well, Russ Baker takes a look at that. I want to read you a little bit from his book, Family of Secrets. Is it possible that entities such as Zapata Offshore, Stratford, Arbusto, and Harkin appear to persist without profits for great stretches? And then he goes on to say, to the trained eye, they look more like classic money laundering ventures, raising the question of where all that money originated. Well, Russ Baker has a very interesting theory, and exactly how it ties in to why we have a Bush presidency 41, a Bush presidency 43, why we might have another one in the future, and for that matter, why the same puppeteers may already have their strings on the Obama administration. You noticed a lot lately, just popping up in the news headlines, people saying, gosh, President Obama sure seems a lot like President Bush. Sure seems like he's, for a guy who talked about hope and change, sure seems like he's continuing a lot of the old policies. Well, there might be a reason. We'll talk about that in Family of Secrets, the Bush dynasty, America's invisible government, and the hidden history of the last 50 years, next on Coast to Coast AM. This is Ian Punnett. Well, Russ Baker is an award-winning investigative journalist, a writer for the New Yorker, Vanity Fair, New York Times, amongst others, and he is also a contributing editor to the Columbia Journalism Review. That's why it will not surprise you to see that this book, Family of Secrets, is very well attributed, that there are documentable sources, and that the people who give quotes to Russ Baker about the Bush family and about America's invisible government are not invisible. They go on the record with their name, and that just adds to the credibility of the claims of Family of Secrets. Thank you, Russ Baker.
My pleasure.
Let me say that if you are right on the source of the income for these clandestine operations you funneled through these front companies that are Bush family related, if you are right about the source of that, and I don't want to tell people yet what that is, and I'll get back to it coming up, that's going to freak people out. I think it's amazing, and I think what's more amazing is I've been following stories like this for years, and I have never heard of that.
Isn't it remarkable?
And I know that's a tantalizing little morsel we're going to leave out here, but I promise to get back to it soon. First, I want to bring to your attention something I put up on our webpage at coasttocoastam.com. I saw it a while ago. Somebody put up a photo from Dealey Plaza, and it showed what, in a kind of a grainy way, could be George Herbert Walker Bush at Dealey Plaza the day that Kennedy is assassinated. And I kind of looked at that and I kind of shrugged it off at the time because it's a little blurry as a photo. And yeah, it kind of looks like him, but it's not like a dead ring or anything. And then I got right away into Family of Secrets, and you go there. And the way you talk about it, I had to go back and look at that photo and start giving it some new credibility because it seems bizarre to think, and it all eventually will play into our conversation, that somehow President Bush 41 doesn't remember where he was the day that JFK was assassinated.
That's correct.
And not only that he may have been CIA and there at Dealey Plaza. At very least, you make the argument that you believe that 3 future presidents were all in Dealey Plaza, were all in Dallas the day that JFK was assassinated. Can you explain that?
Sure. I mean, it's obviously a remarkable coincidence. Obviously, Kennedy was there. Johnson was there, and of course, he became president right after that. Richard Nixon was there, and the evidence that I cite and document in Family of Secrets suggests that George H.W. Bush was there as well, and so that's very, very interesting. I mean, it's obviously a seminal and a transformative event in our country's history, one of the great unanswered mysteries of the 20th century and really of all of American history. And there are all of those people with this remarkable factor of them all being there at that time.
You know, short of the death of a head of state, a former president or something like that, you never see something like that. I mean, it's really, I mean, it's not just, it seems so far beyond coincidence. Let's be clear. Nixon was in Dallas that week. He flew out just hours before Kennedy flew in. But there's this competing narrative about George Herbert Walker Bush, both that he was in Dallas, that you fairly well document in the book Family of Secrets, and he says he can't remember where he was, and there seems to be all these sort of competing stories about where he was or what he was doing that day.
Yeah, I mean, they're not exactly competing stories. I mean, they are to some degree, but essentially, if you line up all of these specific factors that I do not know have been successfully challenged by anyone or even challenged by anyone, they do, in fact, suggest that he would have every reason to remember exactly where he was, not just because he was there, but because he was 40 years old. He was himself a candidate for the United States Senate at the time in that state. He was a vocal critic of Kennedy. And then, as I hope we will get into, there are some government documents relating to specific things that he said and did that day.
Well, let's do that, because as it turns out, and I mentioned this last hour, he gets briefed after the assassination. Why, if he were running for the Senate and he were at that point just a successful businessman in Texas, why would he be being briefed by the CIA or Secret Service afterward?
Right. Well, basically, so we start with the fact that he has publicly stated he didn't remember where he was. I think he probably was hoping that question was never going to be asked, and it was asked sort of out of context. You know, this kind of random questions you do when you're doing a puffball interview of somebody.
Right.
Just kind of talking about, you know, your life and history and so on.
Where were you on 9/11? That kind of thing.
Yeah, exactly. Anyway, so, you know, he's in a little bit of a bind because there's some information about where he was, but he can't say that. So what he does is he says, I don't remember. And, of course, that's not a great answer. And so we have a couple of interesting documents. One is a declassified document from the FBI, from J. Edgar Hoover, and it basically says that on November 23, the FBI was involved in a briefing relating to the Kennedy assassination, and particularly to right-wing anti-Castro Cuban exiles who we know had some strong interest in Kennedy after the failed Bay of Pigs invasion. They considered him to be a traitor to their cause. And so this memo relates to them, and it mentions two representatives of other intelligence services who are participants in this briefing. One is from the Defense Intelligence Agency, and he is named, and then there is George Bush of the CIA. And so there it is, right in that document that came out in the 1990s.
Yeah, and yet it's a document from 1963. And so it comes out years later, but it's specific to that day that George Bush was briefed, George Bush of the CIA. And yet in the timeline of the future president, he doesn't become CIA until 1976. Right, or 75, 76?
Beginning of 76, he takes office as CIA director.
So he takes office, and there was all this criticism about, well, why him? This is a political appointment. He has no background in intelligence. Well, yeah, maybe he had the best background in intelligence. He was such deep cover that very few people even knew about it, even within the CIA.
Well, that's exactly right, Ian. In fact, the way I work, the way I do my journalism, is I try to go into everything with nothing but questions, and usually very general questions like, why did somebody say what they did? Why did they do what they did? Why did someone like George W. Bush become president of the United States, which is actually how I began the research for Family of Secrets. I had no idea what the answer would be, or if, in fact, if there even was a particularly interesting answer beyond what we already knew. With the JFK module, if you want to call it, of Family of Secrets, I was simply trying to answer why the elder Bush, in the book, by the way, I refer to them, as you know, as Poppy and W, and that's not intended to be pejorative, but simply to distinguish two men with the same first and last name.
Sure.
And those are family nicknames. So anyway, the question was, why could Poppy Bush not remember where he was? And so, yes, you're right. In 1976, he becomes CIA director. It's important to remember that period was the only time in American history where the CIA was seriously questioned and scrutinized on Capitol Hill. There were major hearings going on, the most important ones, a committee run by Senator Frank Church, and they were looking at everything, and they were just shocked, and the American people were shocked by what they were finding, because this agency was completely unaccountable. It was out of control. It was involved in every manner of nefarious and illegal thing domestically and abroad, and only one part, but an important part, were these coups against elected officials in other countries and assassinations, and all these other programs of mind control research, MK Ultra, trying to use psychotropic drugs on people to see if they could get them to do things either unwittingly or against their will, and so forth. A lot of just amazing stuff you'd think would be out of fiction, and so they were under all this scrutiny, and tremendously defensive. There was a real threat that the agency might be shut down or transformed from what we knew it to be. And so here's the agency, and who do they pick? They pick this man, this sort of kind of bumbling, not particularly effective communicator who didn't have much of a track record. He had a few posts doing this and that, but I mean, he really was not a heavyweight. He didn't seem to know anything about intelligence. And I went back and I read all these clippings from the time to see if there was an explanation, New York Times, Washington Post, why this man, and they didn't know. They just sort of said, well, who knows? He's a fresh face. Maybe they're trying to kind of clean up their act or something. And I thought, that doesn't make any sense. And so I went back, started looking, and I found all these indications that he seemed to have been involved with the agency before, in fact, not just in 1963, but as you know, because you've read the book, all the way back in 1953 with the beginning of his offshore oil company.
And I think this is, I guess it'd probably be a good time to break and give the synopsis that you presented to the publisher when you were pitching the book Family Secrets. How would you sum up, as in as condensed form as possible, the uniqueness of the Bush family in the way in which they intersect at so many important historical crossroads in our country and the major lives of the players in our country? They weave in and out of everything, and yet they do it in such a way as that you barely notice that they're there.
That's exactly right, Ian. In fact, I think, I'm trying to remember, when I pitched the book, I think one of my points was, here we were rushing out of the George W. Bush era, with many people saying, glad to be out of that, don't want to hear another word about the guy, let's move on. And I sort of thought, well, that's sort of interesting, because there were so many things that happened in the 8 years that W was president that were disturbing on so many different levels. Violations of civil liberties, domestic wiretapping, a war sold under misleading circumstances, strange appointments, the harassment and replacement of U.S. attorneys who didn't play ball. I mean, they're literally, we could fill the whole 2 or 3 hours just listing these things. And so I thought, so many strange things happen in this country. It seems to me a mistake to just kind of race on and say, let's just put this behind us. And I remembered how so many countries that had been traumatized had had some kind of a period of reflection. Particularly in Latin America, where you had these truth commissions, where they couldn't have a national reconciliation without really studying what had happened. And I thought, our country just loves this kind of collective amnesia, and I'm not going to be party to that. I'm going to go back and look and see, is there anything that we can learn from this? And so that was sort of my pitch. What could we learn? And how I had gone in without any agenda or any particular expectations. Really, that 2 years, I worked on this for 5, almost 6 years in some senses, but let's say 5 years. And the first 2 years, I kind of didn't find anything that was super interesting. And then suddenly looking at a few key factors, including this not remembering where H.W. Poppy was in 1963, I kind of went down this rabbit's hole, and I said, oh, my God. And it was sort of terrifying because, I'm pretty much what you call a mainstream journalist, I guess, perhaps on the margins of mainstream. But, I
Sure.
write for all these, so-called respectable publications. I've been published not just in the United States, but in the top newspapers and magazines all over the world. And I've worked for everybody from, The Nation on the liberal end to Fox News, television and so forth. And so I thought, gee, this stuff is so bizarre and disturbing and even terrifying. And I would show what I was finding to friends and colleagues, people who'd won Pulitzer Prizes and things. And I said, look at this stuff and, tell me if I'm crazy because I feel like I'm losing my mind. And people would just look at all this documented stuff, and then there'd be a long silence. And instead of telling me, don't do this because, you've lost it, they would tell me, literally, the quote would be, watch your back. And so I went, and once I sort of steeled myself, I went to the publisher and I said, this is just stuff that's going to change the way, if you really are willing to publish this and you're willing to get into this, it's going to change the way, not just that you viewed the last 8 years, the George W. Bush period, but it's going to change the way you view much of American history.
Well, Republican and Democratic. And I think that this is part of what we learn in the book, Family of Secrets, is that if the road leads where you suggest it goes, it's in everything. It's everywhere. And it just takes different forms. We see that in a couple of different ways, but we'll get to that more. Again, we're talking with Russ Baker, Family of Secrets, the Bush Dynasty, America's Invisible Government, and the Hidden History of the Last 50 Years. I will tell you, up until reading your book, I thought the most interesting sort of fringe fact about the Bush family was that George Herbert Walker Bush's son, Neil, was scheduled to have dinner the day after the attempted assassination of Ronald Reagan with the brother of the guy who is the shooter, that Scott Hinckley and Neil Bush were scheduled to have dinner the next night. And I always thought, that is the weirdest little coincidence. Isn't that strange that suddenly that would, after reading your book, nothing seems like a coincidence anymore because the Bush family is connected to everybody. They are somehow involved with every story, every major story, like the downfall of Richard Nixon, going back to the JFK assassination, the fact that he was such good friends, and we don't hear about this, but the fact that the Bush family were so close to the Russian emigre handler of Lee Harvey Oswald, the de Mohrenschildt. Is that how it's pronounced?
De Mohrenschildt, correct.
Yeah. Okay. How weird is that? That the shooter for at least one of the people linked to the death of JFK is a really good friend with the guy who, again, is in the middle of everything, just very quietly. And very, very much as Russ Baker points out in the book, so inobtrusive, so quiet that you just kind of forget that he's there. Sort of like how a good spy is supposed to be. And so we'll pick that up coming up next. The intelligence history of George Herbert Walker Bush. And when was he CIA? Why does Russ Baker allege that he was CIA decades before President Bush says he was? And what do the companies that George Herbert Walker Bush was running, what do those companies tell us about his CIA connections? It's really amazing. We'll get to that next on Coast to Coast AM. This is Ian Punnett. So as Russ Baker was saying, the more he kind of dug into the presidency of George W. Bush, Bush 43, the more he saw the same people connected to Bush 41. And then the further he went back in the Bush family, the more he saw the same patterns repeated over and over again. And it sort of seemed like there could not have been all of this could not have been a coincidence. And so he starts digging and he starts talking, and you'd be surprised to see how much he can get on the record in Family of Secrets, the Bush Dynasty, America's Invisible Government, and the Hidden History of the Last 50 Years. Next on Coast to Coast, this is Ian Punnett. Well, in order to get where I want to go with Russ Baker here, let's lay down some timeline pieces here for this story in Family of Secrets, Russ Baker's investigation into the Bush family and to America's invisible government. It's very interesting, very well written, very well documented. And we have to go back to Prescott Bush, the father of George Herbert Walker Bush. And the fact that he was skull and bones, and he sort of sets the model, the template for the sons and the grandsons to come. Can you start there, Russ?
Yeah, in fact, we could start anywhere. You can even go way back. I had to set some limitations in writing Family of Secrets because, as you see, it's quite a hefty read.
Yeah.
And I worked hard to try to keep it reading a little bit like a thriller or something like that. And so I just had to do some triage. But in fact, just to mention very briefly a little bit of background, you can go way back. Prescott's father was tied into the military-industrial complex, although we didn't call it back then, and his father-in-law was a very, very interesting man with tentacles into Bolshevik Revolution era Russia, and there's even a great-grandfather who appears to have had ties to naval intelligence. So this family goes way, way back on it. They also go way back in their ties to Skull and Bones, even before Prescott. But in any case, yes, Prescott, the father of H.W. or Poppy Bush and the grandfather of W, he's a very, very interesting figure. It looks like he was in military intelligence in World War I, although he never acknowledged that. And he was in Skull and Bones, the secret society at Yale that has produced so many very well-connected people. And he also, he really lived a very interesting double life, just like his son did. And actually, even as we will see as we go through the book, that George W. also led something of a secret life. So all of these three generations led sort of secret lives. Prescott became married into this very powerful Walker family, his father-in-law being one of the most powerful financial figures in the country, although not that well known, in part because he was based originally in St. Louis. But anyway, he gets into investment banking, and this firm, Brown Brothers Harriman, has fascinating roots back to England, to banking, and to all kinds of things. And so he becomes involved with what was the largest private banking firm in America, and they were involved with operations all over the world. And you can even go back and read, like I think it's the 1922 issue of The Nation magazine, where they say the something like it was the People's Republic of Brown Brothers Harriman, and it was about how they were able to use the U.S. Marines to go into places like Nicaragua all the way back then to protect their investments. So Prescott was a very interesting fellow. When he became a U.S. senator, the timing was with the same time that his very close friend Allen Dulles became the director of the CIA. And you see Prescott apparently being deeply involved with covert operations all over the world. And as one of the examples I cite in Family of Secrets is he shows up in Hong Kong on a fact-finding mission to see why an effort to assassinate the Chinese leader Zhou Enlai failed. He wanted to know what had gone wrong with this, and so here's this man, has this image as being this family man and very, very proper, kind of moderate, Eastern Republican senator, and he's got all this other stuff he's doing behind the scenes.
And again, that just sort of establishes the same pattern. So then you have George Herbert Walker Bush, who goes to Yale, Skull and Bones. And Skull and Bones Society, the secret society, is sort of the perfect training ground for the CIA, for anybody who had to keep a secret, anybody who had to do something nefarious and needed to have other brothers that they could fall back on for cover. And to enable them to achieve these goals. Skull and Bones is the perfect way to find out whether or not somebody would be trustworthy enough for this CIA work.
That's right. In fact, there were other societies, Scroll and Key and Wolf's Head and so on, and they all had people who went into the intelligence services, because these are people who are, well, first of all, they're, to some extent, they're conformists. You know, they want to belong. They want to be in on the inner circle, and so by definition, there are people who are willing to do what it takes. Many people were tapped for these societies and declined. And so if you accepted with alacrity, you wanted in on this thing. And in fact, it's very interesting because it's just a handful of people who are members every year. And yet, if you go back and you look at, they used to publish or used to be able to get a hold of the lists. They don't do that anymore. But you find people, very powerful people at all levels of government. So it is a route to success, absolutely. Right. And the trade-off is you're keeping your mouth shut and you're cooperating where you're able to with your buddies.
So no surprise that a lot of George Herbert Walker Bush's classmates go openly into the CIA. But here's Bush 41 goes and becomes a pilot during World War II. And yet even there, it would seem as though he was doing intelligence work even back then.
That's right. He certainly was, and that is admitted to tacitly. He was involved with aerial surveillance and using special cameras and so on. It was very, very sensitive work, checking out Japanese installations in the Pacific. And so he was obviously trusted already with some very important work. And that is before he goes to Yale.
Okay. So then graduates, war's over, starting a new life, and by public appearances, at least, he strikes out to go to Texas to become a self-made man, which seems kind of odd when you think about, he enjoyed a good relationship with his family. It wasn't like he was, that he had been exiled or anything like that. But he goes to Texas and gets into the oil business and starts a series of companies. And that's where, it does, again, it seems like a pattern that will be replicated coming up later on in life with George W. Bush. These companies, it's hard to account for their income, shall we say.
Right. He starts out first working for a company called Dresser Industries, which is controlled essentially by Brown Brothers Harriman, the family banking business. And Dresser is a key linchpin in the oil industry, and they provide all these different services that oil companies need. And so they're already very, very well connected. He goes to work as supposedly an apprentice for them, and then he strikes out on his own. And the first company he starts, which is called Zapata Petroleum, he starts with these two brothers who come out of Tulsa, whose family is already incredibly well connected. In fact, a curiosity, just prior to their joining Bush in their company, they were renting the guest house in Austin, quite a distance from Midland, Texas, where this was going on, the guest house of Lyndon Baines Johnson.
Okay.
So that's just one of these hundreds of fascinating
It is. All right, so then so Zapata and its many subsidiaries, they have these offices all over the world, and yet they don't even seem to justify this little company growing that fast and being able to support so many far-flung offices.
That's right. Well, they start the second company called Zapata Offshore, and eventually Poppy Bush takes that independent of Zapata, and Zapata Offshore, Midland, Texas, is landlocked. It's far from any body of water. But he sets this thing up, and he starts traveling all over the world. And I'm examining these records, and I'm saying, well, this does. I've been in business. I mean, it doesn't make any sense. You try to control costs. You try to identify a few, potential customers that can bring in some business. But this guy's going everywhere, including all kinds of places that have no oil. It's not even a good cover, but he's just rushing all over the place. They've only got a handful of rigs. And then you see that one operation they have is a place called K-Sal Bank, which is just off of Cuba. And prior to the Bay of Pigs invasion, as the U.S. is watching Castro, they set up these rigs, and they leased them. The island is controlled by Howard Hughes, who's working with the agency, and they're leased to these big oil companies that have a CIA key operative, a guy named Kermit Roosevelt, on the board, and so they're working hand in glove with them. And the guys on the rigs are Cubans.
And so, again, and including setting up offices in Bogota or Medellin, where there was...
Well, yeah, that's right. In Medellin, Colombia, which is not on the coast.
Yeah.
Why Medellin? It was neither the capital nor a place where a drilling operation would be.
It didn't make any sense. And so we'll get back to that thought. But so here's Zapata, and that's George Bush's company. But then other companies come along, and he serves on the board of directors of these other companies. And it seems like there's a lot of, a lot of quid pro quo operations going on with, big surprise, people who, like himself, were skull and bones, Yale, and connected to the CIA.
Correct. There's a company that a guy who worked for him, who I interview, and as you mentioned, I think one of the strengths of Family of Secrets is I managed to get almost everybody on the record.
Yeah.
And so this fellow, he's circumspect. He's reluctant to tell me much, but I spent time with him. I actually flew down to the Yucatan Peninsula in Mexico, where he's got a plantation, and spent some time with him. And he did tell me some stories, and so this man was an employee of Poppy Bush, and he described Zapata as kind of a strange company, and he said they had all of these affiliates, like I think it was either dozens or hundreds of them all over the world for tax purposes, which again didn't make any sense for a little tiny company that was essentially not even profitable. He said we had things in Liechtenstein and everywhere, and so you say, well, wait a minute,
right,
something else, and this same man later on sets up his own company, which is all over the world, which doesn't make any sense and doesn't really turn profits, and then he hires George W. Bush to work for him.
And so you're seeing again this weird sort of fractal alignment. I'm loving this as I'm reading through it, because it says. It sort of indicates right away, this looks like a front organization for the CIA. This looks like the perfect kind of cover, a non-publicly aligned agent, somebody who does not have a public record of being associated with the CIA, whose every friend and every contact is associated with the CIA, and he's setting up all these offices all over the world, seemingly giving the perfect cover for somebody to come in and out of these offices and either collect information or to start working, on the street level in these countries where the CIA has an interest.
Correct. And in fact, think, if any of this sounds improbable or something, just think about any spy movies you've seen or novels you've read. And of course, because these people are doing stuff that it can't be known what they're doing or who they really are, they all have cover. They all work for companies that aren't real companies, or they are inside a real company but doing something other than what they are supposed to be doing, and so forth. And so any intelligence agency needs a huge capacity for this. So they're always creating fake entities and so on. They've got enormous amounts of money they have to launder. There literally are hundreds of millions of dollars in bribes and operational funds that have to go out. Much of this is black budget, but black budget, even beyond being buried inside the defense budget as the CIA budget is. It's so black that it's not even authorized at all, and the money comes from, we can get into that if there's time, from illicit methods and sometimes illegal operations, and goes out and is never accounted for. But they always need these companies. Yeah,
and this is the perfect kind of company to launder massive amounts of cash, that if the CIA was looking to do that, this would be the kind of company that they could do it through. And that would also help to explain why, at least publicly, why Zapata offshore needed to have so many deductions. I mean, didn't seem like they were generating the income. So maybe if the income suddenly appears on paper, they got to find a way to explain why this company is working the way it is. But all right, so let me just push this ball forward a little bit more. So then we take that back up to 1963 again. Now it would make sense why in this memo from 1963 it identifies that George Bush was briefed after the assassination of President Kennedy, and it said in the memo in 1963, George Bush of the CIA. I mean, that makes total sense now. We tie that all together, and it's like, oh, well, of course he was CIA.
Yeah, that's correct. In fact, there was one, there are a number of things we could have discussed also about the earlier evidence, but just one, I think, very useful one is documents showing that when Poppy Bush set up Zapata offshore, one of the people involved in it was this fellow Devine, who, according to these CIA documents, was a CIA officer. So, I mean, there it is. It mentions Bush, it mentions Devine, and it says Devine was an active-duty CIA officer who, quote-unquote, left the agency to start this thing. So there's that.
Right.
Now you're right. Now we flash forward to 1963, and here's this memo. And it mentions him, and of course, there's this little story there you may recall where when this comes out briefly in 1988, as
this is the best.
Is on his way to being, crowned as the Republican nominee for president. This is published. This article is published in The Nation magazine. It's completely ignored by the media, and it says, hey, there's this memo saying that he was in the CIA years before, and it's completely ignored. Now, how you could possibly ignore the notion that a man who was about to become the president of the United States may have had a secret life, when you think of all the interest in this rather, I think, dubious story about Obama's birth certificate, nobody was interested in the fact that the United States could have had the equivalent of Vladimir Putin, meaning somebody who, instead of being principally identified as what he was, a businessman, diplomat, and so on, was actually involved in this very, very compromised, controversial secret agency.
And let's be forthright about what happened when you looked into the story and you started to call to kind of figure out, okay, so who was the George Bush? If it wasn't George Herbert Walker Bush, who was the George Bush that was briefed in 1963? And this is the part where right away people start playing, it seems like kind of like pussyfoot with the truth, including the guy they end up trying to prop up as the person that was the one who was in the memo.
Yes, in fact, the story I'm about to tell is itself proof of a larger operation going on in 1963. The CIA in 1988, when this comes out, says when this reporter Joe McBride contacts them and says, "Hey, how do you explain this document?" They say, "We never confirm or deny personnel," which is correct. That's what they never say yes or no. Somebody did work for us. That's the correct stance. But there's so much potential issue here for Bush as he's preparing to be president that the agency does something they never do. They suddenly come back. I think the AP or somebody calls them and they say, "Oh, no, that was another George Bush." Well, that right away is completely improper. And so that showed that the stakes were very, very high. And they say there was another guy with that name who worked for us, but so when asked, well, where is he? We'd like to talk. And they say, well, we don't know where he is anymore, which is
right. The CIA does not know where a guy named George Bush was who used to work for them.
Right. Well, it turned out McBride had no problem finding him. He was working for the Social Security Administration by the time he got to him. And he talked to this man, and he said, "Here's this memo," and he showed it to him and so on. And the guy said, that can't be me. He said, "Look, I was just hired in that period in the fall of 63 as a trainee." He basically was approached and offered a chance to try out, and he said, fine. He had a very low-level position. He didn't have any involvement with any kind of briefings or anything at all like that. And he left the agency, I believe, shortly after this whole period of events. And so one looks at that and they say, my gosh, this almost looks like this guy was hired because they wanted to have that name, that there was another George Bush in there at that sensitive point.
It seems crazy to think that there could be another George Bush other than George Herbert Walker Bush. But as you already hear, Russ Baker essentially proves that he was in Dallas. We might make the assumption in Dealey Plaza for the day of the JFK assassination, and at the middle of so many other major stories like Watergate and other things we'll get to coming up. And we haven't even gotten to W yet. So what is this leading to? What is this idea about an America's invisible government? And what would be the source of their income? Well, that's where the story gets truly extraordinary. We'll get to that next. Coast to Coast, this is Ian Punnett. Are you with us so far as we lay out the story arc in Family of Secrets with the author Russ Baker, The Bush Dynasty, America's Invisible Government, and the Hidden History of the Last 50 Years? And that includes Democratic presidents as well. In Family of Secrets, as we've been talking about, it sure seems like Bush 41 was CIA starting at a much earlier time than he is publicly recognized as being the head of the agency in 1976. In fact, a lot of people considered it to be a really odd appointment. Why George Bush head of the CIA? I mean, it really caught a lot of people off guard. But maybe it wouldn't if they really knew what was in his jacket. That starting back in the 1950s, he had set up a series of front companies and was helping to both collect intelligence, to work in countries where the CIA had an interest in learning more and helping to develop contacts, that he was tied tight through Skull and Bones and through other Yale contacts with well-known CIA agents, although some of them, like his partner Devine in one of his companies, it was listed as just recently resigned from the CIA. And then, of course, there's the memo from 1963 showing that George Bush of the CIA had been briefed after the Kennedy assassination. So all very interesting. But let's just say there is some sort of invisible government, some organization that's run through the CIA or through CIA connections. What would be the source of their income? How could they run all of these secret organizations? How could they get all this money to flow through companies like Zapata Offshore? This is the part to me where it just I was slack-jawed as I was reading the possibility of the source of that income coming up next. So even before we get on to the rest of the Bush family dynasty story, let's interject this really interesting piece that I think is in the book. In fact, what is it, like page 346 or something? And I got to page 346 and I just had to sit down and think, okay, that would be amazing if that were true. That the CIA had, or CIA connected people had a source of private wealth from which to run their secret missions that they didn't want to be accountable to anybody else to, and then also the money that they would use companies like Zapata Offshore to launder through. And it's the source of that money that I don't know whether you can ever ultimately prove this, Russ Baker, but it sure is an interesting question. The idea of whether or not the military and people connected to military intelligence collected a huge loot of Japanese gold.
Yeah, this story is one that I was not that familiar with. There are several books that have been written about this in which some unnamed and some named intelligence officials, including some well-known people, have purportedly made allegations that this was true, or at least, seemed to confirm it. But what interested me was how I came upon it is the way that I do my work in general, just following a chain of facts. And I was looking at a company called Harken Energy, and this gets into George W. Bush. Briefly, George W. Bush was involved with a series of unsuccessful oil companies in Midland, Texas. When each company failed, it was snapped up by a larger company that was itself unprofitable, but that made him whole. And actually, he came out looking quite good. He benefited financially from each of these. And so one of these that swallowed a smaller one was this company called Harken Energy, and I decided to try to learn a little bit more about it. So as I explored it, including interviewing the man who had started Harken, who let some people he did not know into the company and then found himself basically kind of kicked out of his own company, and the company started acting very strangely. And so what we see is that Harken Energy, which is almost always unprofitable and certainly unprofitable for the public shareholders, has these huge amounts of money going through there. It's in 1 year, it's got something like $4 million in sales, and then just a short time later, it's got $1 billion in sales.
Right.
And it has the sources, the investors in this company is the strangest bunch of people. So you've got a man who comes in there, and he's a lawyer from New York, and I discovered that his father is an American who spent most of his adult life in the Philippines. He was close with the dictator Ferdinand Marcos, and he was on the staff of General Douglas MacArthur in World War II. In fact, was in charge. He had a responsibility which involved alien or enemy property, and that would have included, if in fact there was, this alleged huge cache of gold buried by the Japanese that they had looted from all over Asia, and this would have been an enormous trove. So there was that. Then we see George Soros, the billionaire, comes in and takes a big position in the company, and then we see a bunch of others. We see Saudis. We see people with connections to the Shah of Iran. We see a billionaire family from South Africa with connections to the apartheid regime there, and connections to diamonds and all sorts of other interests. And then we see Harvard University comes in with $60 million into this seemingly odd and small, little-known and unprofitable company. And so I began looking at the Harvard thing and focusing on that. And I focused on the man who was the head of the Harvard Board of Overseers. And what I discovered was that he had kind of a secret past and basically his own connections to the CIA. And so I say, boy, that's so strange. I wonder what the people at Harvard, the students and their parents and everybody who pay for this very expensive school would feel to know that their money was going into something like this.
And so, okay, so let's go back then a little bit too. So as you look at that, that makes a tremendous amount of sense. If that's true, that the Japanese gold that they would have collected, and then perhaps in every country where they were, they may have secreted some of it here or there, and we start to come across it. And the OSS, or later on just people involved who have an interest in trying to stop the world from ever going to world war again, try to create a kind of new world order, try to control the chaos of all of these different countries. And this fits in perfectly with the George Herbert Walker Bush philosophy, as he was one of the people who said publicly, used the words "New World Order." Let's create a new world order. And I think that it sounds kind of crazy and conspiratorial, but at the same time, the pieces kind of snap together.
Yeah, I mean, in their minds, they're doing good. They've come across this enormous amount of money, and they can use it in the valiant fight against the Bolshevik threat. And so they need to spend huge amounts of money everywhere. They're using it. They're funding student groups and radio broadcasts, and they're paying off double agents and on and on and on. And so there's all of this tremendous amount of gold. Now, as I say, one cannot be absolutely certain of this, but what I think what I add here in this chapter called The Quacking Duck in Family of Secrets is all this background on all these people, this Harvard guy and so on, and all of them have gold connections. And it looks like you mentioned the OSS, but actually General MacArthur kept the OSS largely out of major parts of the Pacific Theater because he had his own intelligence operation.
That's true.
We see Poppy Bush stopping on his way to assignment in the Philippines, in different places, getting briefings from these people. So they're all connected. And so the story is, if it's true, that they find this enormous amount of gold, and they can never, of course, let anybody know. I mean, one wonders how that might affect the world gold markets, even today, because the idea is that the gold still exists and it's still being parceled out. In any case, that's really what this chapter is about, that all of these figures point back to gold, to MacArthur. By the way, they apparently used a lot of it to create something called the M2 slush fund. They were secretly channeling these monies to Tokyo, where they were using it to create the ruling party in Japan, the so-called Liberal Democratic Party, which was a staunch U.S. ally in the Cold War for decades. And the man running this operation was a guy named Alfred Ulmer. Now, what's interesting about Alfred Ulmer is he is a close friend of Poppy Bush, and he shows up, even though he was living abroad, he was a coup expert. He shows up in Dallas the week of the Kennedy assassination, meeting with Poppy Bush. So you see all these incredible circles, circles within circles.
And so America's invisible government, which is a way of looking at the people who are born to wealth, who are inclined to dabble, who feel like they have an entitlement to control the future of history, to control, to shape our history. And I think that that's a fascinating idea, that their heart may be in the right place, but they are unelected and they are not accountable to anybody. And in a way, it makes things perfect sense on how it is that George Herbert Walker Bush and then eventually George W. Bush just keep getting kind of promoted, even though they have really as much of a history of failure as anything else.
That's right. I mean, I think one of the things Family of Secrets does is it contextualizes the Bush family within this larger sweep of hidden history, that they're not really the guys running anything, and they never were, that they're operatives within this complex. And by the way, I have to say, I mean, I'm sort of the last person in the world anybody would label as, the conspiracy theorist in the pejorative sense of that. I don't look for those kind of things. I just, as I say, follow facts, and I'm as skeptical as anyone. But what we are looking at here, I think there's a certain naivete in this country, because we're proud of our country. We love our country. Most of us are good people, idealistic people, and so on. And so we see it as the shining beacon on the hill. But the fact is, if you look at almost any country in the world, I mean, raw power has always existed. There have always been wealthy and powerful families and alliances and efforts to influence power both visibly and behind the scenes. And this is really what we're looking at. We're looking at our inability to see that same pattern that exists everywhere else also happening right in our own country.
Right. And why wouldn't it? I mean, why do we think that it wouldn't? Now, go ahead and let's name some names here. Who do you think are the usual suspects, or for that matter, even new suspects in your research in Family of Secrets that form this invisible government?
Well, it's not like, five guys with hoods sitting in a dark room or something like that. I mean, what you're talking about is you're talking about a mindset. And so in Family of Secrets, of course, I talk about families like the Harrimans and the Rockefellers and so forth, but I sort of hasten to point out that these families are not all sort of unified in that. Most of them, I think the Bushes are kind of an exception in that there's really only one member of even the extended family that really ever kind of came out even semi-publicly and criticized them, a cousin. But generally, you see in all of these families members who aren't happy with that, who take their inheritances and give them away to causes that maybe don't comport with the track record and so on. But basically, those families, I mean, there are all of these ones we've seen over the years, the Mellons and what have you. But it's kind of a mistake in a sense to focus on particular families because you have other lesser-known ones you've never heard of. Often the values and the money passes maternally and the names change. And so it's not this absolute club or anything like that. It's just a kind of a way of thinking. And because these people are used to discretion, and because they are used to networking and forming alliances, and anybody who's seen, what's that movie, about Skull and Bones, the one with Matt Damon, Good Shepherd,
right.
You see, they actually do have, like in the movie, there's this island that they own, and they have in this lake, and they had, they had these dances and so forth, and basically they were even sort of intermarrying kind of within Skull and Bones, and so there are all of these alliances, and as time passes, the complexion changes a little bit. So even though it was very much the good old boys, it was very much originally, kind of the blue blood, sort of Protestant and so forth, it began adding, Catholics, and then you start adding here and there, women and Jews and blacks and Latinos and so on, whoever is willing to be part of basically the power structure and play ball. So you more really have to kind of look at the patterns than really focus on particular names. Okay,
but I'm going to push a little bit on that, Russ, because I think you did some really interesting work, especially when we're going into these formations of these companies. There's just a repetition of names. There's a repetition of power people that we come back to again. They may not be the sole proprietors. They may not be sitting around, like you said, in some sort of candlelit room. But it's interesting to point out that again, kind of like the Bush family, there are people who just keep coming back into the picture, almost no matter where you are and no matter what's happening, and including the hiring of George W. or the funding of George W. Bush in a kind of these series of these failed business adventures before he buys the Texas Rangers.
Well, sure, and keep in mind that again, a lot of the people who I think have a great deal of influence in these things are people we've actually never heard of. If you just simply look at how many, the huge number of millionaires in this country, and then that didn't mean anything anymore, so we started talking about people who had 100 million or a billion.
Right.
Even the list of people who have $1 billion is very long, and we haven't heard of a lot of these people. So we don't necessarily, I can recite names and so on, but some of the better-known names that show up in Family of Secrets, for example, is Buckley. William F. Buckley, I think, led a secret life. William F. Buckley was in the CIA. In fact, he worked in Mexico City with E. Howard Hunt, who shows up in the Kennedy assassination story, and he shows up in Watergate, where I hope we have time to talk about that. And
yeah, we will. Right.
So you see a lot of those names. I mentioned the Harrimans and the Rockefellers, and quite a few of these other families. One of the problems we have, Ian, is that we focus on people like Karl Rove and Dick Cheney, and I understand that, and certainly they're important players in all of this. But when we think that these guys are kind of individual actors on the stage of history, that they go off, people would say George W. Bush doesn't make the decisions, Dick Cheney really control things. Well, no, Dick Cheney doesn't really control things. Dick Cheney was appointed as the head of Halliburton, with a company that had merged with the Bush's Dresser Industries and the other companies, and he was basically told to run that company. And so these things don't happen in isolation.
Right. But it does. They do all play in together again as we see the rise then of George W. Bush coming up later on. But let us focus on that sort of unique piece of history in Watergate and the part that Bush 41 played in bringing down Richard Nixon, because it wasn't just him. Again, it's a group of CIA, little known CIA connected people within the Nixon administration that seemed to work together, not for his best interests.
Correct. In fact, just for a second to just kind of flip back to the JFK thing, I just wanted to say that, there are other things. As you remember, there's another memo where George H.W. Bush is clearly identified, and it's the day of the assassination, and he's calling the FBI and saying, I think I may know who shot the president.
Oh, see, and I teased that earlier, and I didn't get back to that. So, okay, so let's do that coming up, too, because I think it's one of those odd sort of moments. Here's George Herbert Walker Bush, again, somehow connected to the JFK assassination by fingering a guy in his own office, saying, I think this guy might have done it. I mean, it just when you think it can't get odder, it does. Family of Secrets. We'll get back to Russ Baker coming up next, and then we'll get to Watergate and how it is that George Herbert Walker Bush, while advising President Nixon, might have advised him out of office on purpose. From the very beginning, could it have been a massive sort of CIA setup? Watergate? We'll get back to that next on Coast to Coast AM. This is Ian Punnett. Family of Secrets, the Bush Dynasty, America's Invisible Government, and the hidden history of the last 50 years. Okay, so have you ever heard the story of George Herbert Walker Bush turning in somebody that he works with, pointing the finger at them, saying, I think this guy did the assassination of JFK? It's an amazing little tidbit of history. And again, it goes back to, we look at every major political event, and somehow there's like not just 6 degrees of separation to the Bush family. It's more like 1 or 2 degrees of separation. And that reminds me, I do want to get back to his years, too, not just with the Nixon administration, but then coming back as the vice president with Ronald Reagan. And then how much we can get to of W, I don't know. But it's all very interesting in the book Family of Secrets. And we'll get to that coming up next on Coast to Coast AM. This is Ian Punnett. Family of Secrets, Russ Baker is the author. And, okay, so it does seem like just so many of these stories just seem to sort of defy logic. We put up on the webpage a photo. It probably isn't George Herbert Walker Bush, but it was interesting to think that through the work of Russ Baker, we're able to pretty much see that he was there in Dallas that day. The 3 future presidents of the United States were all in Dallas the day of the JFK assassination. But that's not the end of the so-called coincidences. Okay, so we know that he was briefed as a CIA agent in 1963, according to the government. And how did it happen that he would send a letter to the Secret Service, or was it the FBI? I guess it was Hoover, identifying somebody in his office as being a potential shooter? Russ?
Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Okay, it's even stranger than that. On November 22 at around 1:45, right around the time they were announcing the president's death, a call came into the FBI's Houston office, telephone call from a payphone, and it was a man identifying himself as George H.W. Bush, giving his address and saying he ran a company called Zapata Offshore, so he was fully identified. He said, I'm giving you this information, but I'd like to remain confidential. I may have some information on who shot the president. And so he mentions a man, and it turns out that the man was no threat at all. It's also odd that he was calling the Houston office rather than the Dallas office. But in Family of Secrets, I have an entire chapter just on this thing. And we go through this, and we see that not only was the man no threat, but he knew he was no threat. In fact, he knew the man. In fact, at the very moment that he was calling the FBI to rat the man out, Bush's own assistant was at the man's house asking him to do something for their campaign office, which gave the man an alibi. And in fact, not only that, but Bush's assistant then drove the man to the Secret Service's offices. Secret Service didn't even come out to interview him. They drove him there to help clear him. And so you see this sort of circular, it looks like a kind of an alibi ring.
An alibi ring. Explain that.
Well, I mean, in other words, First of all, the man, James Parrott, who was mentioned by Bush, he could have gotten in trouble for just on the basis of this phone call. But because Bush's assistant was able to easily clear him, Mr. Parrott didn't have any long-term consequences of that. As far as Mr. Bush himself, you have to say, well, if he knew clearly that this man was no threat, why did he make the phone call? And then you have to say, well, it was for some reason, I guess, to establish something in the records. And again, this is just a hypothesis, but what he did factually do was he established in the records that he was trying to be helpful, that he was claiming to be a private citizen, and of course that contradicted the other declassified document showing him working for the CIA. But here he's saying, I'm a private citizen, I'm trying to be helpful, and so the other thing he does is he says, I'm calling from Tyler, Texas. And as I document in that chapter of Family of Secrets, he makes a big deal about, I want you to know I'm in Tyler, Texas. Well, of course, Tyler means he's not in Dallas. I then go and I show how close Tyler is to Dallas, that he had been on the private plane of a man with a very interesting background. We then see Barbara Bush come into the story. Years later, when Poppy can't remember where he was that day, she suddenly, in her memoirs, produces a letter that she purportedly wrote that day, which has little tantalizing clues where she misspells people's names. But it's like a murder mystery. But I go back and I figure out what was the correct spelling of the name, and it's
right.
One is this Ulmer, who's a CIA coup expert, and he's meeting with Poppy that week. He lives abroad. He's come in especially to meet with Poppy, and there's Poppy and then of course the final piece of this thing where I discovered that in fact Poppy was in Dallas. That he was in Dallas the night before, speaking to a little oilman's gathering, and presumably stayed the night in that hotel, and was in Dallas that morning of November 22. And we don't know when he got to Tyler, Texas, only that he got to Tyler, Texas sometime before 1:45 p.m.
Let's move forward then to the years in the Nixon White House. Again, he sort of seems like the history of George Herbert Walker Bush is that he fails up.
That's correct.
Go ahead.
That's absolutely correct. He really was never very distinguished at all. I mean, one of the things in Family of Secrets I did was I was trying to say, how did a guy like George W. Bush, so unaccomplished, become president? And that's sort of the second half of the book. The first half is, as you say, the father, and he really was pretty unaccomplished. But Nixon really made him. You know, Nixon, he managed to get elected to the House of Representatives, but just as a freshman congressman, they already managed to push Nixon to put him on his short list of possible vice presidential candidates in 1968. He didn't make it. They were angry at Nixon. But then Nixon appoints him in 1970, after he loses the U.S. Senate, he appoints him as UN ambassador, something for which he had no qualifications at all. And then he appoints him the head of the Republican Party in 1973 at the height of Watergate. And so I thought, what's this about? And I went back to try to figure out why Nixon was doing them these favors. And what I discovered was, again, another secret history. And there's 3 chapters in Family of Secrets about the secret relationship between Richard Nixon and the Bush family, going all the way back to the beginning of Richard Nixon's career, 1940s. And it appears that Prescott Bush had a hand in choosing Richard Nixon in the first place to run for the House of Representatives. And that was an issue where bankers were angry at a particular congressman they wanted to knock out, and Richard Nixon was the designated person. And so what I conclude from what I gathered was that Richard Nixon was basically beholden to this Eastern group of bankers and financiers and what have you, and military contractors, of which the Bushes were part, and that he basically kind of worked for them in all of his years until he became president. And when he becomes president, you see him chafing and resisting these guys. You see him fighting with the CIA. You see him having a secret foreign policy where he was cutting out the Pentagon. He and Kissinger were negotiating with America's enemies, and there was a threat, as with John F. Kennedy, that they might have, wound down the Cold War. They might have ended the Vietnam War and so forth. And I'm not trying to defend Nixon. Nixon was certainly a controversial figure with a lot of troubling aspects to him. But it seems that when he became president, he wanted to establish a legacy, and he started doing things that angered these power centers. And here we see Poppy Bush, presumably working with the agency already for many, many years, perhaps unbeknownst to Nixon, and now he's pointed him to these high positions. And then we start looking at Watergate, and we see all of the same figures that we see in the Kennedy assassination scenario. People like E. Howard Hunt, people like the burglars tied in with the Cuban exiles that Poppy Bush worked with. And there's this whole pattern that I discovered and I lay out in Family of Secrets, where prior to the burglary, there were all these acts committed purportedly in Nixon's name with zero evidence that Nixon knew about them, all of which seemed intended to be discovered. They were all leaked to the press and all intended to make Richard Nixon look bad.
Now, that's the thing. I have to say, just to my discredit, I never really considered that the break-in could have been intentional, could have been laying the groundwork for such a disaster as to sucker sort of Richard Nixon into it. That they all went in with their IDs. What we think of as sort of bumbling would have completely not fit the pattern of these experienced, special ops guys.
That's right. They were all CIA or CIA connected, and ultimately, what I think was going on there, and this is just conjecture, but I think informed conjecture, is that there was a power struggle with Nixon, and so they made this sort of daring idea that what they would do is they would commit these acts purportedly in Nixon's name and make it look like Nixon had forced the CIA to do all of these illegal things. And then he would get in trouble, and the CIA would say, hey, we don't do these things because we want to. We do them because the president makes us do them, which was untrue. And so as you point out with the burglary, you had James McCord, who was a very high-ranking, very important CIA person who is with the burglars, and he tapes the door, the entry door. They didn't even need to tape the door at all. He tapes the door, and he puts the tape on it horizontally so it shows up when you close the door. So right. The security guard discovers it, and he takes the tape off. He's not even curious, and then McCord goes back and puts the tape on again horizontally, and it's very, very clear. And Nixon, when he first heard about the burglary, he said, well, this whole thing sounds absurd. When they first found the burglars, there was no connection to him, and he said, this is just absurd. Why would anybody do this? There's nothing even in those offices anybody would want. He goes, it looks almost like a setup. And as I document in Family of Secrets, you start seeing that they're trying again and again and again to get this story out and to make it stick. And you see the role of Bob Woodward with his background in top-secret military work prior to being a reporter.
Yeah, I thought that was really interesting, the Bob Woodward connection, the military intelligence connection to Bob Woodward.
Yeah, and the very interesting backgrounds of John Dean and Eagle Krogh and Alexander Butterfield, the man who told the Senate about the secret tapes. And I have to say, I've studied these tapes, and these tapes are not the way we understand them. If you check enough of them out, you can see that Richard Nixon didn't know about any of these things. He was sort of befuddled, and he's sort of trying to figure out what's going on, and he's clearly being manipulated. And there's an effort to sort of make him create a cover-up. He's saying, but why would we cover anything up? We don't have anything to cover up. And they're saying, but I think there's some things you don't know. You need to issue a statement and so forth. And it just looks like this very, very elaborate, sophisticated operation. All of these people with intelligence connections.
All of them with intelligence connection, and all of them shepherding. All of the people that are not Nixon's people are all intelligence folks who are shepherding him into disaster. Where there were the smaller group of people who were Nixon loyalists, and they get totally thrown under the bus. And it's just I never really thought of this here's George Herbert Walker Bush giving Nixon some of the worst advice he could possibly give him under the circumstances, getting him to go along with it, and then he comes out of it just fine, ends up being appointed head of the CIA. And again, go back, why that? Why the head of the CIA out of nowhere? Why would Gerald Ford do that?
That's right. Well, Ian, the thing is we don't really study our history very, very well. And this is what I think stunned me in my research was how many things, the major stories in our history, they're just completely wrong, or we didn't examine who's Gerald Ford. He was on the Warren Commission. He played a key role in the single bullet theory, and then they get Nixon out, they put him in, he brings in Rumsfeld and Cheney, people don't even remember this, 30 years ago. Rumsfeld and Cheney, and they have this so-called kind of palace coup, and they say, bring Bush in, and they bring Poppy Bush, and he becomes CIA director, and on and on and on. And so you see this, it's almost like a rolling coup d'etat. It's almost like, these guys, and this is true, when you're in these permanent bureaucracies, you don't have a lot of use for these elected presidents. They're an annoyance and a problem for you.
Well, and this is the way to get your guy in without having to get elected. I mean, the pressure that would have existed for Gerald Ford to make George Herbert Walker Bush his vice president over Rockefeller. It would be that, and then to throw him the bone of head of the CIA. And then oddly enough, of course, he's back in the picture again under Reagan. And Reagan at first resisted the idea of having George Herbert Walker Bush as his running mate. We all know that Reagan had open antipathy and talked about that sort of skull and bones crowd, that trilateral commission crowd. He didn't like that.
That's right. Reagan was basically forced to put Bush on his ticket. You see, what it looks like is that certain elements within this community, including people in the CIA. Now, I'm not talking about the whole agency because it's full of very loyal, patriotic Americans who are excellent at their jobs, and they don't know about any of this stuff. So you're just talking about a very small circle of people, okay? But what they're doing is they're saying, I like this guy, I don't like this guy. Kennedy, it looks like he was taken out in the worst possible manner, and I think once they saw that people would never stop talking about this thing, they learned that you can't do it that way. Richard Nixon was taken out another way, very, very complicated, but he was taken out. And as I point out in Family of Secrets, Jimmy Carter was basically taken out. He was kept to one term. A very interesting story about the scandals around his close friend and confidant, Burt Lance.
Right.
CIA-connected banks. And frankly, I'll tell you something. I am now discovering that there are stories relating to things that happened to Bill Clinton that nearly that destabilized his government. And I think what we're looking at is a very a sensitive and fragile situation that perpetuates to the present day. In fact, in Family of Secrets, I quote a former high-ranking Republican official who said to me, "Why are you surprised?" He said, the CIA has put people into every part of the government, and the people around them don't even know. There are all these people put into the White House to keep an eye on the president. And then I discovered that a former high-ranking official had been tasked by Allen Dulles back in the 1950s to use military cover. That's how they did it. They put people in as these so-called, military attachés in all of these departments. So we've got a real problem on our hands. I think it still exists to the present day. I think Barack Obama, wittingly or unwittingly, is right in the middle of this thing. And Ian, that's why I founded this nonprofit, nonpartisan website, whowhatwhy.com.
Right.
Where what I'm trying to do is to do journalism now and in the future about what's going on and to kind of explore these deeper currents behind the surface events that we get distracted by. We spend all our time on. We want to look at these things, get it out of the corporate media and have it be entirely a publicly funded thing, and look into these kind of things, both the historical things and the current things, because it seems to be on a continuum.
Well, and again, that goes back to why this is not either Republican or Democratic. This is about people who are controlling the money and who secretly own the power, and they don't want to run for office. They just want the people that they control to run for office so that they can effectively change things to bring back to them a more profitable situation both in this country and around the world.
That's exactly right. In fact, if you look at the policies, you mentioned this at the beginning of the show, the Obama policies, and you say, well, this guy is, or at least presented himself as a reformer, and yet things seem to be the same on many, many issues, certainly as far as Iraq and Afghanistan. The range of options that he seems to have are so narrow. On the economy, basically a continuity, Bernanke, and then bringing in people like Summers and Geithner, who are so tight with the J.P. Morgan, Chase Manhattan, Goldman Sachs, on and on and on. It just seems like with all these possibilities in the world, nothing is considered except a very, very narrow sliver that is acceptable to the exact same people that have always been, driving things.
And I'm open to the idea of seeing that President Obama can do it differently, but I would say so far, much to the chagrin, especially to many of the people that elected him, it's the same meat, different gravy.
Right, but the point I'm making is it may not be, and again, this is just conjecture, it may not be that he's just the same as these other people. It may be that he simply doesn't have the range of movement. If, in fact, all of these things I document in Family of Secrets are correct, and they're all factual, and they're all footnoted and with the documents, then he really just can't do anything about this.
Right. Well, maybe maybe he's muscle bound. Maybe he's constricted, and maybe he sees in the long run, maybe there's already been some sort of, he can already see the writing on the wall of what will happen in 2012 if he plays ball. And I know that sounds really cynical, but after reading Family Secrets, I'm sorry, dude, I come back to thinking there are just a lot of people out there that know where all the bodies are buried. They know how to manipulate people. They know how to get what they want, and it doesn't matter to them whether it's a Republican or a Democrat in the office. They simply just go on business as usual. Family of Secrets about the Bush dynasty and then about America's invisible government. I'm going to open up the phones here, but I'm going to warn you, we really haven't gotten to all of the material in the book. So you're welcome to ask questions or to make comments, but I reserve the right to get to a few more of these questions in the last hour, because it's just worth knowing about the work of Russ Baker. Link up to him through coasttocoastam.com. This is Ian Punnett.